Hey, it's me, Viv, an internet Exmo, here to tell you more stories of the Book of Mormon. Let's get started.
Book of Mormon stories, internet Exmo told to me. Give the truth so you can satisfy curiosity.
If you remember, we left off last time with Jacob, who was Nephi's much younger brother, and Jacob wrote some stuff, and then he realized that he's getting old, and he says he realizes he must go down to my grave, is the phrase he uses. How poetic. And so he just says he's passing the plates to his son Enos, making him promise to take care of them and obey the commandments. And then Jacob's last words are, "Brethren, adieu." Like, slay bitch. When did we pick up modern French? This use of adieu has actually sparked some debate because it's an odd choice. Mormons argue that adieu was actually the most appropriate translated word, that it was more than just goodbye because of like the origins of the word adieu. But at the end of the day, I guess you could argue that Joseph Smith just felt that this was the word that was the most appropriate translation. So whatever. Okay, so now we have Enos, who is the son of Jacob and nephew of Nephi, grandson of Lehi, and somehow it's 420 BC. The start of the Book of Mormon was 600 BC, so 180 years have passed, but somehow Enos is only the grandson of Lehi. Last episode, I mentioned how Jacob was born about 591 BC, so this is 171 years after Jacob was born. So I guess if Jacob lived to be really old and had Enos really late in life, and then this is also when Enos is old, so like, let's say that Jacob had Enos at 85, and then now this is when Enos is also 85. That's the ballpark of ages we'd have to be talking about in order to make this work. But also, Jacob lived long enough after having Enos to be able to have the talk with him about taking care of the plates, and Enos says that his father also taught him to read and write in the ways of the Lord. So Jacob would have to not only have had Enos around the age of something like 85, but then have lived long enough to have Enos get old enough to teach him to read and write and like have this talk with him about proper care of the plates. I know I'm always getting hung up on like the ages of people and stuff, but it does feel like a bit of a glaring issue to me, but whatever. Let's just not think about it too hard, since this is all made up anyway. So Enos is like, all right, let me tell you a story about my wrestling. Spiritual wrestling, that is. He went out into the forest one day to hunt, and he was letting his mind wander, as one does when one is out in the forest. And he suddenly thought of the spiritual teachings of his dear old dad, Jacob, about eternal life and the joy of the saints. And he was just struck in that moment. And so he kneeled down and he started praying and crying to God. And he was sitting there just a blubbery mess for hours because night came, and then finally he heard a voice saying that his sins were forgiven and that he would be blessed. And then the voice specifically tells him, "Thy faith hath made thee whole," which is kind of interesting because it's Joseph Smith's calling back to what Jesus says to when the woman with the blood disease who just wanted to touch the hem of the garment, like remember that story from the Bible? So Joseph Smith just really put a lot of work into making the Book of Mormon sound kind of like, he was like trying to make it sound in the same style as the Bible, because he felt that obviously it made the Book of Mormon seem more credible as being from God. So here's like a specific example of that. So anyway, then Enos, he gets struck with anguish about his people, the Nephites. And God is like, hey, don't worry about them. I'm going to be fair and give them blessings based on their diligence in keeping the commandments, and I'll only bring them sorrow if they transgress. And then Enos starts worrying about the Lamanites. Remember how the Nephites were the generally righteous ones who decided to follow Nephi, and the Lamanites were the evil ones who decided to follow Laman and Lemuel? Well, he's worried about the Lamanites because they're still being all evil and like keep trying to pick fights and are like swearing their wrath on the Nephites. So Enos is like, if the Nephites for some reason fall into transgression and are destroyed, and for whatever reason the Lamanites haven't been destroyed, then please make sure these records are kept and get them to the Lamanites at a future point when they're ready so that they could be saved. So God is like, Kate, I'm God, and I've got a whole scheme here going, okay? And I promise to bring the Lamanites around in my own due time. So after this emotional night in the forest, Enos starts prophesying about it to people, and the Nephites did try to reach out to the Lamanites to convert them, but the Lamanites were just too hateful. And he describes how the Lamanites are just absolute savages who are all bloodthirsty and filthy and idolatrous. And they dwell in tents, and they shave their heads, and they barely wear any clothes, and they are skilled in bows and scimitars and axes. In fact, many of them eat nothing but raw meat, and they're always trying to destroy the Nephites. As for the Nephites, they are still planting and farming, and they have cattle and goats, and he mentions horses again, which for those who missed it, horses and nothing even similar to horses existed in North America at the time. But he says that it took a lot of harshness and preaching to get the Nephites in line. Uh-oh. They had to be reminded of wars and destruction and death and judgments of God. And they had to be stirred up continually to keep them in fear of the Lord, to keep them from speedily going down to destruction. Which I think this sounds like a kind of miserable way to live, to be honest. But according to the Book of Mormon, it's just too hard for people to ever live righteously without the constant fearful reminders of God, to have God's wrath just constantly hanging over their heads. Do you think God has ever heard the phrase, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar? You know what I mean? Like, positive reinforcement works better than negative reinforcement. But I guess I'm not God. Or am I? You don't know. You don't know. I could be. You don't know. No, I'm not. But or am I? So Enos sees that he's getting old, and he waxes poetic about how he's seen many wars between Nephites and Lamanites, and he's preached and he's prophesied, and now it's time for him to go up to that great mansion in the sky. And now we have Jarom, who is the son of Enos, and he's like, "Okay, I'm gonna make this quick. I'm not going to write any of my own prophecies or revelations, because what can I really say that wasn't already revealed and written by my family before me? But I will say that the Nephites are still mostly righteous, but there's some urban sprawl happening, and the Lamanites are more numerous than the Nephites, but they're like still wicked. So the Lamanites are murdering and drinking the blood of beasts. Yum. And there was a big battle, and even though the Lamanites did outnumber the Nephites were able to push the Lamanites out of their cities because of their righteousness. So overall, the Nephites are thriving and modernizing, and both groups are spreading and having babies, and the Nephites are keeping hope alive for the coming of the Messiah, and they're repenting of their sins, which keeps them from being destroyed. But the Lamanites haven't been destroyed, and they are apparently being the opposite of righteous. So again, this message of be righteous and prosper is kind of falling flat because they're wicked. The Lamanites are wicked, and they outnumber the Nephites, and they seem like they are prospering just fine. The Nephites are the righteous ones, but they're the ones that have to live with God's wrath constantly hanging over their heads. I don't know. Doesn't really build a great case for why to join the righteous ones. You know what I mean? Okay, now over to Omni, who is Jarom's son. And Omni is like, yeah, I'm writing here just because my dad told me to. And I was a warrior who fought in wars to protect my people, the Nephites, and I myself am kind of a wicked person. I haven't really kept the commandments, to be honest. So, whatever. I pass these plates on to my son, Amaron. Thanks for keeping it real, Omni. And Amaron is like, yeah, so the Lord came and destroyed the part of the Nephites who were too wicked. He had to do it because he did promise all those times that he would preserve them if they were righteous and that he would destroy them if they were wicked. So, he had to do what he had to do. Which, again, why do the Lamanites not just get destroyed then? Okay, so now, anyway, Amaron is like, so now I pass these plates on to my brother Chemish. Anyway, Chemish is like, yep, here I am. I pass them to my son Abinadom. And Abinadom is like, I killed a bunch of Lamanites to defend my brethren, the Nephites. And then a guy named Amaleki is like, hey, I'm Amaleki, son of Abinadom, and I want to tell you about a guy named Mosiah. Mosiah was told by the Lord that he needed to leave the land of Nephi because there was just too much overall wickedness happening, so he needed to get out and take as many of the righteous with him who would listen. And they had to go wander in the wilderness. Seriously, yes, more wilderness wandering. So then he and these righteous people, they wandered in the wilderness and they end up at a new place where there were apparently already people that was called Zarahemla. And the people of Zarahemla are like, oh, hey, welcome, strangers. And they are pumped to have these newcomers who brought the brass plates with them, like the ones from all the way back from when Nephi chopped off Laban's head and stole the plates. Yeah, they're still carrying around those plates. And there was some like, wait, how did you get here? And wait, how did you get here? Between the two groups. And the people of Zarahemla say that they left Jerusalem at the time of Zedekiah being captured by the Babylonians, which is a reference to Jeremiah chapter 39 in the Bible, and those events happened in 586 BC. So they supposedly had, these people of Zarahemla supposedly had a similar journey out of Jerusalem to the Americas and started this settlement called Zarahemla around 586 BC. Just so you know, if you're interested in how Joseph Smith is trying to anchor this all in a biblical timeline. But the people of Zarahemla had seen their population just explode since coming to the Americas, and they had experienced language shifts. So Mosiah had to teach them his language, and then he, I guess, taught them well enough to take their genealogy as much as they could remember it. And then the two groups combined, and Mosiah was made their king. I guess they just like loved Mosiah so much. They were like, yeah, this stranger just came in and stole our hearts. And so we made him our king. That part seems a little bit like male fantasy to me, but whatever. So the group is all assimilated together. And then one day, a stone with engravings was brought to Mosiah to interpret by the gift of God. We have no information about where the stone came from or how it was found, but it gave an account of Coriantumr. Coriantumr was found by the people of Zarahemla and stayed with them for about 9 months. Coriantumr was a descendant of people from the Tower of Babel in the Bible. Babel in the Bible. And then that's it. That's all it really says in this account of Coriantumr on this big stone tablet. But this thing with Coriantumr is going to come back later on, so that's why I wanted to mention it. So zooming back out, remember how it was a guy named Amaleki who was telling us a little about Mosiah? Well, then Amaleki is like, I was there during this time with Mosiah, and also when his son Benjamin took over, in which there was more Lamanite Nephite drama, and Benjamin forced them out of Zarahemla. And then Amaleki says that he got old and he didn't have any kids, so he passed them to Benjamin since he knew that Benjamin was a good guy. And he signs off with a plea to be righteous. Well, this is where we're going to stop, my friends, for this episode. Tune in next time to discover why it's called the Book of Mormon. A little teaser for you. Okay, thanks for hanging out with me. Love you. Bye.